This is the third and final part of this 3-part Halloween special on Silent Hill. If you haven't watched part 1 or 2, then I recommend watching them first. Links are in the description. Team Silent were not one to linger on a project for a long time, which is why the first 4 Silent Hill games all released within a year or two of the previous games. Silent Hill 3 was no different. While some of the team worked on the director's cut versions of Silent Hill 2, the main staff began work on the sequel. Silent Hill 2 was critically and commercially successful. However, some fans were upset at one thing: the lack of closure. Since Silent Hill 2 wasn't a direct sequel to 1, some fans wanted to know what happened to characters like Sybil, and the baby Harry picked up at the end of the first game. The team were left with a choice. They could continue their idea of making each game a standalone story and only use the same locations, or they could tie up the loose ends from the first game. This would prove to be one of the most divisive decisions in the team's history, as staff members were split. Eventually, the team decided that they would wrap up the story of Silent Hill, and got to work on the Silent Hill 3 that we know today. While some staff members were unhappy with this, it was time for some reorganization anyways. As we already know, Team Silent were never one to stick to a pattern, and just like with the development of 2, some changes would be made. When it comes to the third entry in the series, we really begin to see just how inconsistent Team Silent was. You see, on top of the third entry and the later versions and scenarios of Silent Hill 2, another game was being developed, simply known as Room 302. It was originally meant to be a side entry in the Silent Hill universe, but was later renamed and became what we now know as Silent Hill 4: The Room. Multiple games meant splitting the staff down the middle, which explains why very few staff members are shared between 3 and 4. However, just like with the loss of director Keiichiro Toyama between 1 and 2, some members moved on to other projects entirely, namely Takayoshi Sato. After Silent Hill 2, Sato moved to America and began to work for Konami's American branch, meaning he was split off from the rest of Team Silent. Sato still wished to be involved and pitched ideas to the team, however, he was one of the members that didn't want to go the route of a sequel. At the time, I was in the US already, and I was in Konami of America, and basically, we were kind of contracted to them. And before getting the contract done, my team was already developing new Silent Hill stuff. But our contract didn't meet what they wanted, so we didn't show anything, and they didn't get anything. Since we were external, we had to pitch our ideas like any other third party, and it just didn't work out. Sato has never fully explained what his original plan for Silent Hill 3 was, as he said he could use it in the future. However, he has said that it was going to be a really deep, introspective psychological horror. In another interview, Akihiro Imamura and Akira Yamaoka also stated that the original idea for Silent Hill 3 was much more along the lines of the second. It's unknown whether they're referring to Sato's original idea or a separate script, but regardless, Silent Hill 3 could have gone down a very different path. Speaking of Akihiro Imamura, he was one of the team members that went to work on Room 302, along with drama director from Silent Hill 2, Suguru Murakoshi, and the director of Silent Hill 2, Masashi Tsuboyama. While Sato and Imamura had no part in the development of 3, the team did manage to keep some of Team Silent's veterans around. The first was Hiroyuki Iwaku, the scenario writer from Silent Hill 2. He stayed on the same role and wrote a lot of the scenes and character interactions in the game. The second, also a very important member of Silent Hill 2's development, was Kazuhide Nakazawa, who was in charge of the character animations in 2 and moved up to director in the third entry. Finally, and arguably the most important member of the team, was Masahiro Ito. Akira Yamaoka would split his efforts between both teams, acting as a producer on both games alongside writing the music. Ito and Yamaoka are both integral to the style that Silent Hill had established, but it wasn't viable for Ito to split himself entirely between the development of 2 games. I think this is as good a point as any to fully address why this little video series I'm doing is stopping with the third game and not the fourth. One of the big reasons is obviously time and the workload of making 4 big videos. However, another reason is that I think Silent Hill 4 deserves a very different video to this. Silent Hill 4, to me, feels extremely different to the first 3, which was intentional. They wanted to make something different, not a game, as Tsuboyama put it, that would have been the same old Silent Hill. Silent Hill 4: The Room is the beginning of a long, winding trip that Silent Hill would take before eventually reaching the state we find it in today. It's also very interesting that these games were developed almost simultaneously, and they would be the last projects that Team Silent would be allowed to work on before they were disbanded, but we'll talk a bit more about that at the end of this video. So, with the team split in two and the general concept of the story decided, Team Silent would begin work on Silent Hill 3. However, Team Silent weren't one for making a completely traditional sequel. The story Team Silent eventually ended up going with would see the player take control of Heather Mason, the daughter of Harry Mason from Silent Hill 1. Heather would be dragged back into the town of Silent Hill by a woman named Claudia Wolf, and discover the truth of her birth and who she truly is. The story would bring back the Order, and attempt to characterize them and their religion further, along with showing us the aftermath of Harry's encounter with the Incubus at the end of the previous game. While this sounds like a very traditional sequel, it's actually very low-key in comparison to other sequels. Harry is the only returning character from the first game, and he has no lines and is never shown on screen fully. The plot is definitely a continuation of the first game, and the protagonist Heather visits locations from both the first and second entries. However, there's one very important reason Silent Hill 3 is not a traditional sequel. Heather Mason breaks the mold of Silent Hill and everything that the series has built up. Firstly, Heather is the first female protagonist of Silent Hill, besides Maria in Born from a Wish, along with being the first teenage protagonist. Harry and James are both 30-something males with families who have both experienced loss. Heather, on the other hand, is a 17-year-old girl who lives alone with her father and lives a fairly average life. Her father, Harry, tries desperately to keep her from finding out about her past, and is apparently extremely protective of his daughter, considering he forces her to carry around a stun gun at all times. Where Harry and James are standoffish and sort of awkward, Heather is confrontational and sharp-tongued. If I had to describe Heather in one word, it would be human. She is by far the most expressive and emotive character in the whole series. She's quick to anger and can be extremely blunt with the characters she meets, but she's not mean-spirited. Another way in which she differs from Harry is in her motive for coming to Silent Hill. While Harry's motive was always to save his daughter, and James' wish to find his wife Mary, Heather is seeking revenge. Revenge on Claudia Wolf and the Order, who, about 2 hours into the game, murder Harry in his apartment. Heather shows such a wide range of emotions throughout the entire game, from happiness to sadness, to blind rage and pure confusion. On top of this, Heather receives the most characterization of any Silent Hill protagonist. She expresses remorse over characters' deaths even if she didn't like them. She seems to have an aversion to firearms and seems disgusted by them. We know that she used to smoke and knows what a hangover feels like, showing that she's not the perfect daddy's little princess. In fact, you could say that Heather is an extremely flawed person. She's quick-tempered, carries around a switchblade, and is awfully sarcastic. All of this, plus her design, helps to hammer home how human she really is. If you remember me mentioning in my video on Silent Hill 2, Sato mentioned how he wanted Maria to be beautiful yet flawed, like a real woman. Heather is the perfect example of this design philosophy, even when Sato had left the team. Her body isn't sexualized, nor accentuated by her clothing. Instead, her orange sleeveless turtleneck along with her white vest act as a practical design. The female members of the team decided that Heather should wear a miniskirt to come off as more feminine, instead of the jeans the character designers originally intended her to wear. Her clothes show the player that while she is meant to be very tomboyish and lacks traditional feminine charm, she is very much a young girl. She gets slightly annoyed when Douglas Carlin compares her to his dead son, saying that she might take it better if he compared her to his daughter. Beyond clothes, Heather's face tells us more about her character than anything. For one, she's covered in freckles and blemishes, and her dyed blonde hair seems disheveled. On top of this, the areas around her eyes are red, showing us that she's tired and looks as though she's been crying. She doesn't wear makeup and she has no love interest in the game. If you ever wanted to know what I believe a good female character is, I will point you to none other than Heather Mason. Hell, if you want to know what a good character in general looks like, it's Heather Mason. Sure, she doesn't have the deep, multi-layered complexity of James Sunderland, but she feels like a real person. Beyond that, she's just an extremely entertaining character to watch. She constantly has something to say, and in situations where her father would just listen to the crazy cultist's rambling, Heather is far less agreeable.
I am Claudia.
So what? My daddy always told me not to talk to strangers.
This is very important. It's about your birth.
I'm not interested. Are you still following me? Do I have to scream?
Shut your stinking mouth, bitch!
Much like the previous entries, Silent Hill is full of colourful characters, and each of them incorporates humanity into their design. None of them are particularly beautiful. For example, the old detective Douglas Cartland. He's not a young, fresh-faced, pretty boy detective, instead fitting more into the archetype of the old, tired private eye. His face is wrinkled and tired, and as character designer Shingo Yuri explains, his hair is swept back to cover up his bald spot. Other characters like Vincent were made with a slightly different design philosophy. When looking at the cast of Silent Hill 3, Vincent Smith stands out. He wears nice flashy clothes, which always reminded me of a teacher, and he carries himself with confidence. Everything about Vincent is meant to be attractive, in order to subvert the player's feelings. Vincent is described as a hypocrite behind nice clothes and appearance. He's shady and clearly manipulative, but he does seem to be on Heather's side throughout the entire game. He's just as much a member of the Order as Claudia, and despite his defiance of Claudia's plan to use Heather to finish what was started 17 years ago, he still claims to believe in the Order's god. This brings us to Claudia herself. By all accounts, she's a very plain character, wearing a sort of purple dress and not much else. Her skin is very pale, and her long hair is a sort of silvery blonde. At first glance, she's kind of strange and creepy, but it's hard to pinpoint exactly why. Closer inspection reveals two details. For one, she never wears shoes in any of her scenes, much like Dahlia in Silent Hill 1. The second, and more important, is her lack of eyebrows. Her original designs were far more complex, and eventually the team went for a far subtler and eerie design. Silent Hill 3 has the smallest cast of the first three entries, with only 4 primary characters, meaning each of them gets a lot more screen time and a lot more lines. While they're not as complex as the cast of Silent Hill 2, they're still well designed and well thought out, which I think is a perfect comparison for this game in general. If you were to play Silent Hill 3 directly after Silent Hill 2, you might receive a bit of a shock. Silent Hill 2 managed to tell a deep and complex tale of loss, dealing with depression and other adult themes. Silent Hill 3 still tackles themes of abuse and humanity, but it takes a back seat compared to what the game actually focuses on. If Silent Hill 2 was meant to scare the player with its story and atmosphere, then Silent Hill 3 was created to scare the player with its gameplay. The game uses a few locations from the second game, meaning the team could allow themselves more time to work on the newer areas and the smaller details. Some of the areas in this game are the most nightmarish in the series, with pulsing walls and red grated floors. Of course, the background has almost as much going on as Silent Hill 2, but the basis of the game is simple, yet extremely effective. Throughout the game, Heather sees a particular monster in the background quite often. The creature is passive, content with just sitting out of reach, often seen turning a valve or hanging other creatures and dragging them away. Many players will pay no mind to this creature, as unlike Pyramid Head in Silent Hill 2, the monster never becomes a boss fight, or spends a lot of time as the focus. However, the creature known as Valtiel is very important to the Order and the lore of Silent Hill. Valtiel's mission is quite simple: ensure that Heather makes her way to Silent Hill so that the birth of God may be completed. While Valtiel never outright protects Heather, he seems to be watching over her to make sure she reaches her goal. Seeing as Valtiel is a powerful angel in the Order's religion, his act of turning the valve makes sense. This action is mostly seen when Heather is moving between the real world and the other world, implying that perhaps Valtiel can control the shift between the two. However, one scene in particular shows us Valtiel's true intent. During a game over, there's a random chance that Valtiel will appear and drag Heather's corpse off screen. Since being a host for God will result in Heather's death anyway, all Valtiel is really protecting is the remnants of God left over in her body. It doesn't matter to Valtiel whether Heather is alive or dead. He can either guide her subtly by shifting the world between its two states, or he can drag her body to Claudia himself. By the end of the game, Valtiel still seems to be alive, as Heather makes her way back from the other world, and considering the continued appearance of the other world in later games, even though he never appears, Valtiel could very well be still alive. This is the closest thing that Silent Hill ever gets to a connecting tissue. Valtiel is a sort of G-Man from Half-Life, ever present in the background even if he's not actually visible. He can be seen briefly off screen at points if the player turns the camera very quickly, and is exceptionally powerful if he can control things like the shift between the two worlds. While Valtiel's name doesn't derive from any known religious texts like Samael or Metatron, his design does feature the seal of Metatron on both shoulders. While Valtiel may be the mastermind behind the entire series, like I mentioned, a lot of players won't even notice due to him mostly taking up the background, and players are far too focused on what's happening in the foreground. Silent Hill 3, in my opinion, is when the series really starts feeling good to play. The basics are still there, fixed camera angles, tank controls, but there's a lot more choice. As far as weapons, there's more melee choices than ever, allowing Heather to become an honorable samurai, along with the typical pistol and shotgun that all protagonists carry. This time, however, the rifle is replaced by the much more powerful and ammo-wasting submachine gun. Heather also has more mechanics to work with, for example, the beef jerky. Heather can place beef jerky on the floor, causing certain monsters to see it and begin eating, allowing Heather to walk by without alerting the enemy. While this only works on a few enemies in the game, and only if the monsters aren't already aware of Heather's location, it does allow the player to save some of their more important supplies, like healing items and ammo, for more important parts of the game. As far as graphical fidelity, Silent Hill 3 managed to climb the bar that Silent Hill 2 had set, and do it with grace. This game looks amazing on the PS2, and the footage you're seeing right now is recorded from the PC version of the game with some fixes, allowing it to run at 60 FPS and 1080p, and it looks stunning. Everything else about the presentation is top notch. The voice acting is a lot more agreeable to some people than Silent Hill 2, and the cutscenes are just as well directed. The place Silent Hill 3 truly excels, however, is in its scares. Anybody who has played the game will often cite the scene in Brookhaven Hospital's storeroom as one of the scariest and tensest moments in the entire series. For me, it solidified Silent Hill 3 as a worthy successor and a brilliant horror game. One of the most important themes in Silent Hill 3 revolves around mirrors. In the beginning of the game, after Heather wakes up from her nightmare, the first save point we run into is a mirror. Here, Heather explains that she never really liked mirrors very much, and that she feels the person staring at me isn't really me. When visiting her apartment, Heather's bedroom mirror is covered up, and her bathroom doesn't have a mirror at all. This fear of mirrors relates back to her birth, and shows that perhaps Heather knows that she's not just Heather, but a being split from Alessa Gillespie. This is confirmed throughout the game as Heather begins to remember her past as Alessa and her experiences in Silent Hill. If you've ever wondered why the scene in Brookhaven Hospital takes place in a room with one wall comprised of a giant mirror that the camera puts all of its focus on, then now you know. Besides the obvious placement of mirrors throughout the game, the story itself is one big reflection of the first game. The game follows similar story beats to the first, almost exactly at certain points. Both games start off with our protagonists, whose names both begin with H, in a nightmare that they wake up from only once they die in the dream. Both wake up in a diner and are met by a member of law enforcement, Sybil the police officer and Douglas the detective. Later on, both characters fight a female character on the carousel in Lakeside Amusement Park, and both of them end up in Alessa's room. There are tons of other similarities, but the point has been made. The entire game is a mirrored version of Silent Hill, down to the characters each playing the role of another character. Silent Hill 3 simultaneously pays homage to the original while establishing its own identity. Heather takes on Harry's role, yet she's nothing like Harry. Claudia plays the role of Dahlia, yet Claudia is just as sympathetic a character as Heather at times. It's possible for someone who has never played the original game to play and enjoy Silent Hill 3, so while it's a sequel, it's not 100% reliant on its predecessor. Being aware of the game's reflection of the first just makes it that much more enjoyable. In my opinion, Silent Hill 3 is one of the most criminally underrated games on the PS2, and I totally understand why. Everyone talks about how fantastic Silent Hill 2 is, myself included, and deservingly so. However, since 2 has such an unbelievably high reputation, there's no possible way that the third game could one-up it. This could explain why Silent Hill 3 is quite a safe game. It doesn't try to tell a grandstanding story like the second, and while it has its share of psychological monsters and background secrets, it focuses a lot more on scaring the player. Silent Hill 1 was a PS1 darling. Silent Hill 2 is a highly regarded masterpiece, yet people tend to completely ignore or forget about the third game. Despite this, I think it's not only as scary as the first, but the most enjoyable to replay. Its cutscenes are dripping with character, and it's got some of my favorite areas to explore. While it is safe, Silent Hill 3 also has some very distinct changes that causes it to stand out. While Yamaoka stayed on to make the soundtrack for the game, he wanted to try something unique that he hadn't done before in Silent Hill. Previously, the soundtracks had been entirely instrumental, including the opening and ending songs. This time, Yamaoka decided to make some vocal tracks that would play during the opening and some cutscenes. You're Not Here and Letter from the Lost Days are both sung by Mary Elizabeth McGlynn, and some of the in-game tracks like Lost Carol, which feature vocals without lyrics. While I understand that some people might prefer the instrumental soundtracks, Silent Hill 3 contains some of the best songs in the series, and I really like what they did with the traditional Silent Hill theme for the ending song Hometown. As far as sound design goes, it's your standard Silent Hill affair. Yamaoka has pretty much perfected his brand of haunting sound effects and keeping the player on edge at all times, by choosing when to be silent and when to fill the room with noise. Once again, Silent Hill 3 doesn't try to follow everything that the previous entries outlined. Where Silent Hill had 5 endings and Silent Hill 2 had 6, Silent Hill 3 has 3. 2 normal endings and the joke ending. Both of the normal endings are fairly standard, with the only requirement being how many points the player has racked up throughout the game. Simply have less than 4,000 points to receive the normal ending, and over 4,000 to receive the possessed ending. In contrast to Silent Hill 2, these endings can seem extremely basic, and don't pack the punch that endings like In Water do, but they weren't meant to. The function of Silent Hill 2's endings was to show that the player's actions throughout the game reflected James's psyche. If we look at Silent Hill 3 as being a chance to offer a more definitive ending to the story of Silent Hill 1, then the normal ending serves this function just fine. I'll be the first to admit that the lack of endings after the second entry was kind of disappointing, but one thing I'm glad it does is makes it so that you only have to beat the game twice to receive the third ending, which is, as we've learned, the real important ending. While the dog ending in Silent Hill 2 is hard to beat, the UFO ending in Silent Hill 3 continues the most important side plot in the series, and expands on it the most. Continuing tradition, both Harry and James are present in the ending, which sees Heather return home to find the 2 protagonists joined by an alien. Once Heather tells her father what happened to her in the shopping center, Harry shows the most emotion he ever will, and jump kicks a wooden board, threatening to destroy Silent Hill for harming his daughter, while Heather looks on saying,
Oh, Dad, you're the coolest!
This is followed by, what else, but a fleet of alien ships coming down on Silent Hill and completely obliterating the whole city from the sky, and then cut to credits. There's a lot of very bizarre things about this UFO ending in particular. For example, the original voice actor for Harry Mason from Silent Hill 1 didn't return for Silent Hill 3 since he has no lines in the main game, so the voice of Harry in the UFO ending sounds like, well...
I'm going to Silent Hill, and I'm gonna bust some heads!
Yeah, but, I mean, compared to everything else in this scene, it's quite normal. Here's where we get to the depressing parts of the story. Silent Hill 3 released around summer 2003, and while it was well received and sold well, it didn't light the world on fire. Development continued on Silent Hill 4, which released a year later in summer of 2004. The next year for Team Silent is shrouded in mystery, and has only gotten clearer in very recent years. While interviews between summer 2004 and April 2005 see key members of Team Silent openly discussing the future of the franchise, it seemed that Konami had other plans. In April 2005, Team Silent was officially disbanded and the key members were distributed between different projects and teams. For years, rumors persisted about why the team split, some believing that members decided they wanted to work on other projects, while others believed that Konami themselves disbanded the team. Due to the context of recent developments with Kojima and the way Konami treats its employees, it's very easy to imagine Konami not being happy with sales and disbanding one of their most beloved and creative teams. However, it's important to remember that people of 2005 had no idea what Konami would become. Years later, in 2010, Kenzie LaMar, an artist on Silent Hill Homecoming, confirmed that Konami were in fact the ones who made the decision to disband Team Silent, and not the team themselves. This comment can be taken with a grain of salt, seeing as it first appeared in a comment on his DeviantArt page, but this is the closest thing to an answer that we've received regarding Team Silent's disbandment. And with that, Silent Hill began its troubling decline into how it now stands. The saddest part about the way Team Silent were unceremoniously ejected from Silent Hill is how many members ended up doing very little in the industry. Takayoshi Sato managed to find himself a job as a visual producer at Nintendo, however, other members weren't so lucky. Akira Yamaoka, who stayed on Silent Hill far longer than the rest of Team Silent, eventually left Konami and is currently working with Suda51 over at Grasshopper Manufacture. The problem with tracking the different members is that a lot of the less well-known team members were merged into other teams like Kojima Productions, and others such as Hiroyuki Iwaku were apparently sent to work on Otome phone dating sims, which doesn't show up anywhere on his resume for obvious reasons. The disrespectful way that Team Silent was handled, both to the staff and the fans, who still haven't been painted a clear picture of why or how, is shocking to say the least. But not when you consider the history of the team. If you remember all the way back in part 1, I mentioned that Team Silent was kind of a problem team. For one, it was mostly comprised of members whose projects had failed, on top of members like Sato, who for all of his brilliance, made things very difficult for the higher-ups by demanding to be allowed to work alone. We know that Silent Hill was never as commercially successful as it was critically, and Silent Hill 4 was the last straw, apparently not selling enough copies for Konami's liking. Team Silent came out of a very strange place, and their short run between 1996 and 2005 was a miracle in and of itself. While we can only speculate as to Konami's reasoning, it really does read like Konami just didn't like Team Silent and would have taken any excuse to disband them. The rest of Silent Hill's history is well documented. The very next game, Silent Hill Origins, was passed between two separate teams before it was eventually salvaged and released. The series was tossed between Climax Studios to Double Helix, back to Climax, over to Vatra Games, and then way forward for the last real original Silent Hill game. The bastardized HD ports of 2 and 3 were handled by Hijinks Studios. What do most of these studios have in common? Besides WayForward, who made Book of Memories, which I hesitate to even call a Silent Hill game, all of these studios had little to no experience making games before being handed one of the most beloved and influential survival horror series of all time. Vatra Games had only made one game before they were handed Silent Hill Downpour, and Hijinks Studios had spent most of their lifetime making Karaoke Revolution Glee games? No matter what way you look at it, Silent Hill has become one of gaming's most mismanaged franchises, and this is without even taking into account the Hideo Kojima PT debacle. While it can be difficult to overlook what Silent Hill has become, it's important to remember what it was. Despite recent years, some good games have managed to trickle their way into the franchise, and for every homecoming, there's a game on the PS2 worth replaying again. There may be more bad Silent Hills than good ones. If Konami ever decide to give it another stab, it may be even worse than some recent attempts, but that doesn't take away from the games that I and many others fell in love with. So, to wrap this whole journey up, I want to remember Team Silent for what they were, an insanely creative team that managed to release 4 quality titles in a very short period of time. It's easy to forget in the world of AAA games, with their microtransactions, glorified gambling, annual releases, and buggy unfinished games, that there are a lot of great developers out there who care for the products they're making. For every Star Wars Battlefront, there's a Cuphead. For every Konami, there's a Platinum Games. And without a shadow of a doubt, for every cancelled Silent Hill project, there's another horror team out there willing to continue the legacy that Team Silent started. So, in summary, thank you, Team Silent. And thank you to every game developer who fights through the mediocrity of this industry to do something truly special. And of course, most importantly, thank you to everyone who has watched this far. This has been quite a hectic month for me, and the fact that I managed to get this done is shocking. I hope you learned a thing or two about Silent Hill, and if you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing. I have no idea where we're going next on this channel, but I can definitely tell you that my next couple videos will be a lot shorter and more digestible than these, because I think we all deserve a bit of a break. So anyways, I'll leave it here, so this video doesn't run on too long. Thank you so much again for watching, and if you shared the video around, then thank you even more, and I'll see you when I see you.